just like to thank Bernd and the organising committee for inviting me. And what I'm going to do is I don't have slides. I'm going to split it into sort of 3 sections. I'm going to sort of rattle through these points. First, some of the ways that PLOS are addressing the issues that Bernd has introduced. Then some of the inherent problems with the system, which again I think overlaps with a lot of what has been discussed already at this conference. And then a little bit about the potential solutions that we can all take part in. But what I wanted to do was just to first start with by emphasizing one of the points that Bernd made, which is this difference between distinguishing between deliberate fraud and misconduct and a lack of reliability in the research that is published. And I want to quote a clinical neuroscientist from Edinburgh University, Professor Malcolm McLeod, who's done a lot of research into the research process himself, in particular about publication bias and poor reporting, and he works with John Ioannidis and others. And this was in response to a question on an AMA Reddit that PLOS conducts about some of their papers with the authors of those papers. And he says, sometimes people see things which aren't there, things that look like patterns that are just random noise. When your career depends on seeing patterns, you can fool yourself. So best to do everything you can to stop yourself being misled. And I think this is a lot of the issues we're trying to deal with centers around the incentive system for why researchers are producing papers that are not reliable. So in terms of PLOS, we publish about 33,000 articles a year. We cover all the natural and biomedical sciences. And some of the steps we're taking to increase the reliability of research we publish includes, and I think this is one of the primary things, is actually making the papers open access. By making them not just free to read, but free to reuse, it means that they are available for independent scrutiny by anyone who actually wants to look at the validity of the research we publish. A hugely important thing that we also encourage, and one of the innovations of PLOS One, was that to encourage the active reporting and publication of negative results. And I think this has been endorsed, the whole PLOS One model has been endorsed by the many publishers that have copied it, and the fact that we get such support from funders in this regard. In 2014, we introduced a policy by which every author who published with PLOS would have to write a data sharing statement. We actually didn't change our data sharing policy. We've always expected our authors to share the data, but what we did with the statement was ask them to state where that data was publicly housed and how other people could use it. And I know there are criticisms about the fact that we haven't necessarily enforced this fully, although journals like PLOS Biology check every statement and check the data is there, and data, for example, behind the figures is also uploaded to the paper as well as being deposited in repositories. But even though we don't check systematically across all of PLOS One, the evidence we have that the availability of data with papers has massively increased since before we introduced that policy. And of course, the policy is monitoring and evolving. There are many open questions about it. What constitutes the data underlying a paper? What to do when data is very large? The problems with supplementary data, field-specific data, community norms around sharing data. And to help with this, we've actually just recently brought in a data advisory group with external experts chaired by Phil Bourne to help us to resolve some of these questions, because we don't have the answers to what is acceptable often. In terms of the sort of more general ethics, we go through a process of checks which include figures, the data statement, competing interests for authors and editors, the appropriate ethical approval. We ensure that there is trial registration where it's asked for. We look at the standards of presentation. We check for plagiarism and for salami slicing. And we actually have several teams working on ethical and reporting issues within PLOS. We have a team of staff editors that are specialized in the clinical research, others for animal research. We have a general special issues meeting where basically anything can be brought up that needs to be discussed, that can't be handled in a sort of a more general way. I mean, there's some very straightforward cases. We also have external advisory boards to help with this, and these include external experts. We have ones for human research, we have another for animal research, we've got one on dual use. We undergo training of editors. We try and structure many of the review forms that reviewers are coming in, so we're getting the information that we need, and we're continually updating those policies. And we go through, in fact, PLOS itself, and PLOS 1 in particular, go through an incredible series of filters of checks before a paper ever reaches an academic. And this is done both externally through the great help we get from editorial office, but also we have about 60 to 80 publications assistants as well as staff editors. And so cases are essentially escalated, and eventually, you know, if we can't deal with them, we'll take them to the institution or to the funder. And so we always follow up with authors, reviewers, institutions and funders wherever we see a breach is raised to us. We also adhere to checklists, and some of these are mandated, like Consort, Prisma, Miami. We encourage others, such as the ARRIVE guidelines for animal studies. Actually, the basic sciences in dealing with preclinical research is way behind that of the medical sciences in terms of reporting and standards of checklists. We're also trying to introduce more evidence-based policy, and in fact, we're working with researchers to look at the effectiveness of some of these checklists. We're also working with ways to credit author with for sharing data, so looking at data citation. Also the publication of protocols, and we're looking into trialing that. We're also publishing a lot about the research process itself, including about malpractice, and PLOS Medicine many years ago had a big expose of ghostwriting, but also about publication bias, about poor practice, about p-hacking. And PLOS Biology recently launched a collection and section that covers all of PLOS journals to look at research about research, meta-research. And this actually has an external editorial board, including people like Malcolm McLeod and John Ionides. We are sensitive, of course, to information that shouldn't be made public, such as patient confidentiality, rare species locations. And because we are a large open access publisher, we are able to do this, and I think we have a lot of experience of doing this at scale. And PLOS One also, because it is so big, the largest journal in the world, actually provides us with a unique insight into the publishing landscape and the problems that are now pervasive among all of publishing. So in terms of the issues that I think contribute to the rise in misconduct and the sort of lack of reliability, and again, I'll go through these quickly because Bernd has talked about them, but the basic problem is an incentive system that doesn't reward sharing, transparency, and reliability. And this is fueled by hyper-competition, and that's an expression that Bruce Alberts uses, to get into a few select journal. And this actively discourages sharing. And it also focuses research in only a very few fashionable topics. So there's actually a lot of neglected areas. Of course, there's publication bias, lack of negative results, no publication of protocols, citation bias towards studies that are positive and not negative, and those that only support established theory rather than critiquing it. There is also plenty of evidence that higher impact journals have poorer reporting practice, lower ethical reporting, higher number of retractions, and also there are press releases of papers that focus on more speculative and often observational studies rather than the reliable studies. And it's not just high impact journals that have been pointed to. There's a recent paper showing that highly ranked institutions are also producing, their faculty are producing papers where the standards of reporting are lower. There's also an increase in big data and also a growing global collaboration, including multidisciplinary research. And I think there's a huge question about whether our peer review system, which is generally one editor and 2 reviewers, can actually, whether it's feasible to assess the validity of paper and big data in that process. And I think there is a big question mark around whether the peer review system is working. And of course, Bernd mentioned we have a lack of training of young researchers around these issues, around data stewardship, around peer review, publication ethics, experimental design, and often no leadership from the senior researchers, as well as a lack of relevant infrastructure and processes at the institutional level to support that. There are also fundamental geographic differences in scientific standards and the culture of scientific practice. And I'm sure all publishers are aware of that and the sort of different legal issues in different jurisdictions. But this is not just between countries, it's between states in the US and within different member states in the EU. There's a complete lack of policy alignment between funders, institutions, and publishers. And reiterating Bernd again, by the time it gets to a publisher, it's generally too late. We can't fix the data stewardship problems that are happening well before publication. And there is misconduct, but the largest problem lies in the unconscious bias of all players in the system in relation to data sharing against early career researchers, against multidisciplinary science, against women, and against the overlooked contributions to science. So not just we focus on papers, but we're not looking at software, sharing of data and reagents, of biocuration, of peer review itself. And it's interesting that despite the researchers' commitment to the scientific method and journals' commitment to rigor and reliability, no one seems to be prepared to actually open up their own data on the process and practice. And I think things like the meta-research collection that PLOS Biology is organizing is starting to open that up and looking at research on research. And I think also the other thing is that often it's the journals that are blamed for not doing enough and not doing enough checks and publishing poor work. But the status quo is being maintained by all stakeholders, by funders, institutions, researchers, publishers, and even science journalists. No one is innocent. We're each waiting for someone else to change practice. And, you know, for example, there's no incentive for institutions to change their hiring practice when the fact that it's based around journals, or for journals to move to a system that focuses on reliability and reusability rather than on higher risk, more speculative science that attracts readers, citations, and money. I suspect I've run out of time before I get to my solutions, so I think I might leave my solutions now and come back to that. So thanks very much.